All right, so this past weekend, 60 Minutes aired an interview with Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. Now, it was a good sit-down with the former CIA director that covered a pretty wide range of topics, some of them highly important if you ask me. Now, the mainstream media, however, didn't really pay all that much attention to what he said, and in fact, I'm pretty sure that CNN was the only network that even bothered following up on some of the Secretary's statements this morning from what we saw. And for some reason, their takeaway was that the following line of Panetta's was really wild and shocking.
Leon Panetta is creating some international buzz. He says he remains convinced that someone in Pakistan's government must have known that Osama bin Laden was hiding in that country. What do you know about the rifts between our country and Pakistan, and is it getting any better?
These types of statements from U.S. officials like Defense Secretary Leon Panetta certainly won't help, especially statements that can't be substantiated. Certainly a man in his position, if he makes a statement like that, it's going to create a lot of buzz, and that's what's happening. The Pentagon backing off from that statement in an effort to mend these very fragile relations.
All right, so considering that Panetta then reiterated that this wasn't based on any fact, this was just his opinion, and then the Pentagon had to walk it back, that's an opinion also that's been repeated about 1 million times over at this point. Personally, I wouldn't have chosen that as the only clip worth talking about. Far from it, in fact. You see, one of the most telling parts of this interview with Scott Pelley, who conducted it, was when he decided to ask about the Obama administration's killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, the U.S. citizen that was killed in a drone strike in Yemen last year. Now, we found out through various leaks that there was a secret legal memo that justified the president okaying the killing of a U.S. citizen without due process. Although, of course, that memo remains secret, and according to other reports, it will remain so even when Attorney General Eric Holder gives an address touting the national security efforts of this administration. Now, you guys know how I feel about this. That was a sad and scary day for what we know as the Constitution and the rule of law in this country. And yet, with the exception of perhaps Scott Pelley, nobody else in the mainstream media really seems to care all that much. So just take a listen to what the Secretary of Defense said when he was questioned about the legality of such a move.
Despite the fact that this person may be a citizen, he is first and foremost a terrorist who threatens our people. And for that reason, we can establish a legal basis on which we ought to go after that individual, just as we go after bin Laden, just as we go after other terrorists. Why? Because their goal is to kill our people.
All right, so did you hear what Panetta said there? Despite the fact that Awlaki was a U.S. citizen, he was first and foremost a terrorist. And that's okay to essentially consider him a citizen, or excuse me, to essentially not consider him a citizen anymore, because his goal is to kill our people. Now, there are a number of issues with that statement that should concern everybody out there. Let's not forget that the Obama administration has never released any of the evidence that they say they have to prove that Awlaki was playing an operational role in planning any al-Qaeda attacks against the U.S. As far as we know, Awlaki was indeed very vocal in the videos that he posted on YouTube, but that alone doesn't make you a terrorist. So, all that we can get from Panetta's answer here is that the evidence doesn't matter. Due process in a courtroom to prove that evidence doesn't matter. If the government calls you a terrorist, they can kill you, and the rest of us are just supposed to take their word for it. But you see, it didn't end there.
This person wanted to suddenly raise questions about whether or not they're terrorists, and they were to return to the United States. Of course, they would be entitled to due process. That's something we provide every U.S. citizen. And for that matter, frankly, any terrorist who's arrested, we provide due process to that individual as well. But if a terrorist is out there on the battlefield and a terrorist is threatening this country, that person is an enemy combatant. And when an enemy combatant holds a gun at your head, you fire back.
All right, so here we have numerous other problems with Leon Panetta's statements. He says that if Awlaki had wanted to return to the United States to raise questions about his own terrorist label, then he would have been entitled to due process. Big problem with that logic is something that Glenn Greenwald also pointed out today at Salon.com. You see, there were never any charges brought against Anwar al-Awlaki in a courtroom. The only reason that we even found out that he was on an assassination list is because it had been leaked, not because the administration openly said it. So how are you supposed to return to the U.S., turn yourself in if you don't even know that you're being targeted, and if you have no courtroom to question it in? Now, let's also not forget that the statement made by Panetta that any terrorist arrested is provided due process, well, that's just false. How about so many of the detainees that are still being held at Guantanamo Bay? The president deemed 50 of them untriable early on. Many have been cleared and yet are still being held at Gitmo. And if you want to claim that it's because they were apprehended on a battlefield and not right here in the U.S., then where do you draw the lines for that battlefield? This is part of the problem. The dangers of this overly expansive global war on terror is that anything can now be deemed a battlefield by the administration. And then here's one more little tidbit for you today. You know, NDAA the president signed on December 31st of last year, the one that codified indefinite military detention into law, well, it's already being applied to legal rationale. Take the example of a Guantanamo habeas case of al-Madawani versus Obama. Now, if you go to the Lawfare blog today, you're going to find the government's legal argument for his detention affirming the authority of the president to detain any person who is part of or substantially supported al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or associated forces that are engaged in hostilities against the United States or its coalition partners. Now, that is the language of the NDAA. So seeing that is by no means shocking, but just so you know, it's already being used. So there you have it, folks. Not only some blatant misinformation coming from the Secretary of Defense, but really poor rationale that essentially says that if we say someone's a terrorist, we can kill him and we'll never have to provide the evidence. Now, I'm so happy that Scott Pelley actually asked him those questions. We need more journalists asking those questions. But despite everything that was said, the complete lack of respect or adherence to the Constitution and the laws put in place that promise due process, the mainstream media didn't even blink. Now, instead, they chose to miss.